No, let's get started. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the very first Tea Science Tuesday. If you are watching this online, well, actually, first I'll introduce myself. My name's Eric. I'm a PhD student at Tufts University, and I study tea. I study how climate change affects the chemistry of tea. And before that, I worked at a tea shop, and I've been into tea for a long time. And so I really enjoy talking about science and food and tea, and so that's why we're doing this. If you are watching this after the fact and you really, really wish that you could have seen this live on Instagram and joined in and asked questions and all that, let me know in the comments what times would be better for you. And if there is enough of a demand for me to do this later in the day, then I might consider changing it. This time works really well for me, but if enough people really want to get in on the live streams, then I might change it. All right, so today, the very first Tea Science Tuesday, we're talking about caffeine because it is one of the things that people think about the most when they think about tea. When I worked at a tea shop, probably the majority of questions that customers asked were about caffeine. Which tea has the most caffeine, which tea has the least caffeine, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's why I wanted to start with caffeine. So what is caffeine? Caffeine, I built caffeine molecule. This was a great excuse to pull out my old molecule building kit from organic chemistry. This is a caffeine molecule, and it's a type of molecule called an alkaloid. And the only really important thing to get out of this model is that these blue things are nitrogen atoms, and it's got 4 of them. And nitrogen is usually a limiting nutrient for plant growth. What we say in biology often, or in plant ecology, is that molecules like this are expensive for the tea plant to make. So when you fertilize a tea plant, oh hi cup of chai HQ. When you fertilize a tea plant, you're giving it nitrogen, right? And it needs that nitrogen to grow, but it also needs it to make caffeine. So there's got to be a reason that it's making this caffeine, right? It's not making it just for us to wake up. It's not making it for humans. And so what it's doing with this caffeine molecule is this is actually a defense compound. It's toxic to insects that would try to eat the plant. Take a sip of my tea here. I'll talk about the tea I'm drinking in a little bit. So it's an insecticide. Caffeine's an insecticide. It's a neurotoxin for insects. It's probably a neurotoxin for people too if you drink enough of it. Although I don't know if you could actually do that physically with tea. You'd probably have to be like taking pure caffeine or something like that to actually get that level. Oh, hey, lastly. Nice to see you. So by the way, audience people, you can ask questions. This is supposed to be informal. So if you have questions, I can answer them. So one of the biggest myths about caffeine in tea is that you can say something about how much tea or how much caffeine a tea has by what type of tea it is. So for example, for a long time, a lot of big tea companies were promoting white tea as low in caffeine. And I've heard other things. I've heard people say, green tea is low in caffeine. I've heard people say green tea is high in caffeine. All sorts of things. Really, none of that is true. There's very, very little that you really can't make any predictions about caffeine in a tea based on whether it's green, white, black, oolong, etc. Because the difference between those types of tea is in how it's processed, and the caffeine is really not created or destroyed very much in processing. So processing has very little to do with the caffeine in the tea. The amount of caffeine in the tea is decided before the tea is even picked, really, mostly. So we talked about how caffeine's an expensive molecule for a plant to make because of all these nitrogen atoms that it takes. And so there's this whole area of plant defense theory. There's a whole bunch of different hypotheses explaining why plants make certain chemicals in certain parts of their bodies. And one of those is called the optimal defense hypothesis. And the optimal defense hypothesis is really simple. It just says that plants are going to defend the most valuable parts. And what does most valuable mean? Well, it's a little bit arbitrary, it's a little bit subjective, but we're talking about the parts that are going to help the plant grow and reproduce the most. So for a tea plant, that's going to be flowers and fruits and stuff, obviously, although I'm not sure about the caffeine content in the fruits. They might be defended in other ways. But for leaves, the most valuable leaves are going to be the youngest ones. And that's because they've got the most of their life left to live. It's because they have the most potential to do photosynthesis. Cup of Chai HQ says, I was told caffeine changes during oolong baking. Yeah, so one of the processing steps that does degrade caffeine is like heavy roasting. So a really roasted tea like hojicha, as a roasted green tea, that is actually going to be pretty low in caffeine. And probably some heavier roasted oolongs are also going to be lower in caffeine, and they're not going to be caffeine. None of these are going to be caffeine free. But yeah, that's a good point. Roasting does actually change the caffeine because it just breaks it down from the heat. So that optimal defense hypothesis, right? We're expecting the youngest leaves to have the most caffeine, and that, in fact, is really the biggest predictor of caffeine in a tea, is what's the proportion of buds or really young leaves. So I've got a couple of white teas here, since white tea is one of these teas that people often say is low in caffeine. And so white tea can actually look really, really different. So I have one white tea here that is like all these, it's just buds. It's only these unopened leaf buds with these silvery hairs. This is going to be pretty high in caffeine as far as tea goes, because it's that young bud. Buds are always going to be higher in caffeine. So this white tea is actually probably going to be really high in caffeine, if I were to guess, relative to other teas. And then I've got something here that's kind of in the middle. This is a white tea that's pressed into a cake. But I can show you. You can see that there are some silvery buds pressed into there, but there's also some bigger leaves in that mix, right? And so that's probably going to be a little bit lower in caffeine. And then the one that I'm drinking is this white tea that you see a lot less of those silvery buds. There's still some in there, but mostly what this is older leaves that have expanded. So this is probably going to be lower in caffeine. So that's like really the only thing that you can use to predict the caffeine content of a tea is how tippy it is, how many young leaves are in there. Does caffeine content degrade with age? You know, I was just thinking about that this morning as I picked out this aged tea to drink. I want to say yes, but I don't have that literature like fresh in my brain. I don't actually remember if that's true. I think I'm going to do, though, I'm going to add to the syllabus for the class, I'm going to add a week about aged teas, because I think there's some really cool stuff to talk about that aging process. So yeah, this white tea that I'm drinking is from 2012. So a lot has changed since it was first processed. And I would guess that caffeine is probably pretty stable over time, but it might, in really aged teas, it might degrade. But I don't actually know for sure. Somebody's maybe studied that, but maybe not. I don't know. So the other thing, of course, that you have to think about with caffeine in tea is how you brew it. So maybe one of the reasons, this is my hypothesis, the reason that this sort of myth about white tea being low in caffeine, maybe the reason that myth spread is just because tea companies were telling people they should brew white tea at cooler temperatures because it's delicate. So, you know, a lot of the brewing suggestions on white teas from major tea brands say to brew it at like 160 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty cool. I'm brewing this with boiling water, so, and it's delicious, I think. I think that suggestion is probably a good one for people who maybe don't want to pay as much attention to how long they're steeping their tea. Because if you do steep white tea for a really long time in boiling water, it's going to probably be awful. and it would be really high in caffeine. Cooler water is going to extract less caffeine. It's also going to extract less everything. So I don't like brewing white tea at those really cool temperatures because white tea is already really mild tasting. And so you brew it at cool temperatures and I don't know, to me it kind of tastes like nothing. Maybe there's some white teas out there that are really good at that cool temperature, but I haven't brewed white teas like that for a long time. I usually hit them with pretty hot water and just do a really fast infusion instead. Just get those leaves hot and hydrated and get the flavor out, and then pour the water. So, but that idea of the brewing temperature is also one of the confusing things about the literature for tea and caffeine, because depending on the paper you look at, they brew it differently. So I looked at skimmed a couple papers here, and some of them are brewing tea sort of like in the suggested way that you would brew it, and they're comparing the tea in the cup using the brewing suggestions, so changing the temperature and the time of brewing depending on the type of tea. And that is maybe relevant to the amount of caffeine that people are actually drinking, because maybe they're going to follow those suggestions. And then other papers are trying to be a little bit more controlled and scientific about it, and they're comparing, they're brewing everything 5 grams boiling water 5 minutes. And that's producing something that probably not that many people drink, especially for like a green tea or something, just because that's boiling water 5 minutes is a lot for a green tea. It's going to be real strong. And so, that's a better comparison of sort of what's in the leaf, but it's not really as relevant to what people are drinking. So it's really hard to actually make any predictions about amount of caffeine in tea. That's what I'm trying to say, basically. Also, just like as a side note, I think it's interesting that it seems to me, I've spent summers in China, and so I have a very limited experience with Chinese culture, but it seems to me that people in America care a lot more about caffeine than people in China. People in China don't tend to drink, or the people I was with didn't tend to drink tea like first thing in the morning as like I need to wake up with my cup of tea. They were more often would drink it like in the evenings, afternoons. Nobody I talked to seemed to be like worried about not being able to sleep because of drinking tea late in the day. So I don't know, I don't know if that was just because of the people I was hanging out with were tea researchers, or if that's a more generalizable statement. But I think there is some cultural aspect to people being so concerned about caffeine in the US. Let's see, what time is it? How long have I talked? Oh, I've only talked for about 15 minutes. That's good. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about, I think the last thing that I have on my syllabus here is caffeine sensitivity. And this is something that I had a question before the stream started about this. And this is actually really interesting. So I read a little bit about this idea. So I think that I'm probably pretty sensitive to caffeine, but I'm not as sensitive as some other people I know. So my old coworker, Joe, who I used to work with at the tea shop, Happy Lucky's Tea House in Colorado, he was very sensitive to caffeine. He wouldn't drink any caffeine really after like 11 a.m. Because he said that if he did, he wouldn't be able to get to sleep. There's other people like Tea Sleuth in the chat here who claim to be totally caffeine insensitive, who just like don't get it. They're like, what? Why not drink tea at midnight and fall asleep a minute later? Don't have that problem. So it turns out there's at least 2 genes that affect your caffeine sensitivity. There may be more. I'm not a caffeine researcher, like I don't study the physiology of how caffeine affects humans. My downstairs neighbor my old downstairs neighbor studied that, and I wish he was here. I would have called him up and asked him. So there's at least 2 genes. One of them is a gene that codes for the enzyme that breaks down caffeine in your body, that metabolizes it. And there's a fast and a slow version of that gene. And so remember, you get 2 copies of every gene. You get one from your mom and one from your dad. And so if you end up with 2 copies of the fast gene, the fast version of the gene, you're going to metabolize caffeine really fast. But if you have 2 copies of the slow version, then you're going to metabolize caffeine much more slowly. And the effects of caffeine are going to last longer through the day. And if you have 1 copy of each, I think you'll probably be intermediate, although I'm not sure how that works. Sometimes you have a dominance, like you do with there's actually not any really good human examples, but we talk about like eye color, right? The blue eyes being recessive. So it might be that slow metabolism is recessive. I'm not actually sure, but there's some variation in that. Now, there's also a gene for how sensitive you are to caffeine. And this is an adenosine receptor. So this is a receptor this has to do with the neurochemistry of how caffeine affects us, right? It's a adenosine antagonist, I think. So it interacts with these adenosine receptors, and you can have adenosine receptors that are affected more or less by caffeine. So that was, there is one other topic I want to talk about, but I'll get back to it. Let's see. Yeah, that was this paper. Bloop. And I'll put I'll put like a annotated bibliography in the description for this video. So if you guys want to check these papers out, you can read them on your own, or you can at least skim the abstract. So this paper is all about a variation in this adenosine receptor and how it affects sleep. And so in it, they asked people to sort of self-report whether they were sensitive to caffeine or not sensitive to caffeine. And then they tested their genetics. And it turns out that the variants of this gene actually mapped really well onto whether people self-reported as sensitive or not. And the people that were sensitive to caffeine had this adenosine receptor that was more sensitive, and it also caused them to have more insomnia. And so just in general, too, which was kind of interesting. So people that had this gene, even the people that don't drink caffeine regularly, reported having insomnia more often. And so they're maybe just like more prone to sleeplessness, anxiety overall, and then the caffeine really exacerbates that and makes the difference really big. But it's totally independent from how fast you break down caffeine. And so that's what this figure is. These 2 lines are the 2 different types of that receptor. And then they gave them 2 doses of caffeine, right? One there and one there. And this is how much caffeine is in their saliva. And so it decays at like the same rate, regardless of what type of receptor you have. So you could sort of think about your own caffeine sensitivity, and you could think about how long that effect of caffeine lasts, and also how intense it lasts, or how intense it is, and how much it affects your sleep. And you could be sort of any combination of those things, right? You could be someone who it affects you really acutely, but it doesn't last very long. And so then maybe that means that your receptor is the sensitive one, but your metabolic enzyme is the fast one. And so I think that's kind of cool. And that just those 2 genes alone explains a lot of the variation that people have and how they're affected by caffeine. And there's probably other genes too. There's probably ones that people know about, and there's probably ones that people don't know about. And I just haven't read the literature, and I'm not a caffeine researcher. So I think that's pretty cool. Let's see. So yeah, Kukicha HQ says, I can drink tea all day and night and sleep well. And T-Sleuth says, wow, I feel tired all the time and nothing I've ever found wakes me up. Yeah, so you're probably that caffeine insensitive genotype, I'm guessing. So yeah, it's interesting stuff. I didn't know that about the caffeine sensitivity before, so that was really cool to learn. One other thing that I thought I would talk about in this little mini lesson. So good. Sorry, I'm taking a tea break here. Let's see what else. I have bipolar disorder and anxiety disorder. I wonder if it has something to do with it. Yeah, I don't know. Again, not my area of research. I have no idea if those adenosine receptors that are affected by caffeine, I don't know what else they do necessarily in the brain. So I'm not sure. Not my area of research. I'm a plant guy. I know about what plants are doing, not about what humans are doing necessarily, how they work. One other thing that I meant to mention earlier is about the evolution of caffeine. And so recently I wasn't actually involved, but the scientific community got a genome sequence for the tea plant, which is really cool because it allows us to learn about how the tea plant evolved, excuse me, and it also about how we could breed tea plants to be more tolerant to climate change or have better flavor or all sorts of things. It lets us take a look into how it works. But one of the cool things that came out of it was this paper about the evolution of caffeine. And basically all they showed, not all they showed, but one of the things that they showed in this paper is that the genes that code for enzymes that make caffeine in the tea plant evolved separately from the ones in cocoa and the ones in coffee, and probably also the ones in yerba mate and guayusa and those other caffeinated plants. I don't think we have genomes for them, so we don't know yet how those caffeine genes evolved, but the ones in tea and coffee and chocolate evolved separately. And so what that means is that, and it's also, the other thing, get this, it takes 13 different enzymes to make caffeine. So it's not just like one thing evolving, it's 13 things evolving separately. And so caffeine, what that indicates, like as an evolutionary biologist, you would look at that and you'd go, okay, caffeine must be a really good solution for a problem. If 3 groups of plants arrive at it totally independently, they arrive at making the exact same molecule. This is caffeine. It's the same exact molecule in coffee and tea and cocoa. It's this. If it was anything else, if I changed one of these, it wouldn't be caffeine anymore. So it's exactly the same molecule being made in these 3 different plants, evolved separately. And that's because it is this really effective insecticide. It's this really effective toxin to insects that has this really nice side effect of making us feel awake, and it's addictive, and that's maybe another reason, right? Coffee is really successful because humans have propagated it, so they've domesticated us using their caffeine, right? It's a dual function molecule. It keeps insects away and gets humans to grow you. so it's a really cool kind of thing that came out of that research to see that it evolved independently. Are they similar in chemical makeup? Yeah, exactly. They're exactly the same. So that's one kind of major myth or misunderstanding about chemicals and about chemistry, is that is there a difference between like natural caffeine and synthetic caffeine? Those don't mean anything. If it's caffeine, it means it's this. Like that's how chemistry works. We name the molecules based on how all these atoms are put together. If they're put together any different way, if there's any slight changes, it's not caffeine anymore. So there used to be, you might encounter this word like theine or matein. I still occasionally hear people say that, mate doesn't have caffeine, it has matein. That's not true. Those names were given to those chemicals before anybody could actually figure out what they were. This was like before we had the instruments to figure out what the structure of a chemical was. We just gave it a putative name, said, okay, we know it's similar to the caffeine in coffee, has similar effects. I'm going to call it matein because it's in mate. And then later on, researchers found out that nope, it's exactly the same molecule. It's caffeine. So other ones are guaraná, is a fruit that has caffeine that you may find in if you go to a Brazilian cafe and you get a acai bowl. It's like a smoothie bowl that they pour this caffeinated syrup on it, this guaraná syrup that has caffeine in it. And my guess is that it was probably also evolved independently. But I don't know about that one. I don't know if we have a genome for that. So yeah. So that's my stuff. That's my thing about caffeine. I think we're probably almost out of time. It's about 4 more minutes. I'm trying to keep these to about half an hour. But if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if you're watching this video after the fact and you have questions, leave comments. I will get back to you if I can, if I know the knowledge, or I can try to point you in the right direction at least. So anyway, questions, comments? Again, also if you're watching after the fact, you really wanted to be on the live stream, which right now I'm doing at 9 a.m. Eastern time. Chime in if you can't make it and you really want me to do it another time so that you can be in the audience. Let me know and I'll consider it. Do commercial grades like PG Tips have higher caffeine content than equivalent non-commercial teas? I'm going to say that probably the answer is yes, but not because the leaf material is younger leaves. So probably those commercial teas are actually older leaves is my guess. They're probably a larger plucking standard. So they're picking more like 3 leaves in a bud for those commodity teas, but they're all chopped up into little bits, into dust in those tea bags. So when you brew a bag of PG Tips, you put it in that hot water and just sort of all the caffeine comes out. Caffeine's really water soluble. So you really can't like get the flavor without getting all the caffeine. So that would be my guess. I'm not actually sure. I think in most of these, like in one of these papers that I have about caffeine content, yeah, so this one, all the comparisons are all bagged teas, and I think in this other one that I have, all the comparisons are loose leaf teas. So I don't think I have a good paper that's like comparing loose leaf to bagged tea or commodity tea to specialty tea. I'm not sure how valuable that comparison would be. I think it would make more sense to just compare like loose leaf tea versus that same loose leaf tea crushed up and put in a tea bag. Unless you're going to do a lot of commercial teas and a lot of specialty teas. There's so much variation in tea that it's really, some papers say, oh, white tea is high in caffeine, and others say, oh, white tea is lower in caffeine. And it's just because they use different white teas, they just made different choices in what samples they were going to use. Yeah, so that's my answer. All right, well, hi, Fin Anime. I'm actually just about to sign off. But I'm going to put it up I think on YouTube, on the Tea Geek channel. I'll let you guys know in an Instagram post where this ends up going after the fact. But I'm going to take off for the day and go do some writing, trying to finish up my PhD. So thanks for joining, and I'll be here next Tuesday, and I can't remember what we're doing next Tuesday, but there's a syllabus on my website, ericarscott.com. If you click on the blog tab, there's a blog post with a little table that has a syllabus. I may add things or change things. Let me know if you have ideas or topics you guys want to talk about. I'm happy to do that. So, all right, well, thanks for joining. Bye.